Brought to you by the Astro Youth Taos chapter from STEM Arts Lab, Space on Earth is a student-led podcast that inspires listeners who are curious about space to explore the wonders of the universe through the voices of young thinkers, creators, and dreamers.
Each episode blends personal curiosity with scientific discovery, from the mysterious depths of black holes to the practical impacts of space on Earth, like GPS, climate science, and medicine.
Hosted by STEM Arts students from Taos, New Mexico, this podcast draws connections between space, art, and science, how these things all impact us here on Earth, and their meaning to humanity.
You'll hear raw, insightful conversations about topics like light pollution, the overview effect, lunar exploration, and the societal impact of the space race.
Whether you're into exoplanets, dark energy, or just stargazing from your backyard, Space on Earth makes space personal, accessible, and inspiring. We believe that space isn't just for astronauts and scientists, it's for everyone.
Join us on this adventure as we explore the cosmos from Earth, one story at a time.
Special thanks to the Lore Foundation for helping launch this podcast.
Today we're talking about light pollution. What are the sources, impacts?
So, light pollution, it is human-made alteration of outdoor light levels compared to those that occur naturally. And so it can be simple things like street lights, or there's other types of lights that are used on like sports stadiums, or even just lights that are in parking lots, or the lights that you have right outside your houses. Light pollution is just light that doesn't naturally occur.
Yeah, so the term light pollution is more specifically talking about the effect that all these streetlights and streetlights are the main issue. You do get a certain amount from house lights, stuff like that. But it's mostly any light that's out in the open, especially if it's facing towards the sky. What this does is the light kind of overpowers the natural lights in the sky, like the moon or the stars. Hattie Rose, do you want to build a bit off of that on what exactly can cause light pollution?
Yeah, so light pollution can be caused by like a bunch of things. That can be like buildings, street lights, vehicles, theme parks, porch lights, a lot of things. I do really want to quickly mention I guess what types of light pollution there is before we fully move on to the sources, and then we'll go into impacts and everything. So there's sky glow, which is like an orange-pink haze over cities. There's glare, which is excessive brightness, and light trespass, which is like light spilling into areas where it's not intended. And then there's clutter, which is like bright groupings of lights like in Times Square. I also wanted to quickly mention International Dark Sky Week, which is actually just happened April. It is now May, but is Taylor, do you guys want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, of course. So, International Dark Sky Week is a worldwide celebration that's built awareness about the harmful effects of light pollution. So, International Dark Sky Week was on April 21st to the 28th. And so it just helps to bring awareness about what light pollution is and the different ways that we can help solve light pollution.
Do you want to go a little bit into how wildlife is impacted by light pollution?
Yeah, so that's actually a great thing to bring up. When we think about light pollution, a lot of times it kind of gets little to something that only affects the way that we see the night sky. And this is very far from the truth. One of the main impacts of light pollution is how it affects wildlife in impacted areas. So wildlife and humans are the same, need a day and night schedule to maintain their circadian rhythms and to help support good sleep, good health, and regulation in their systems. When humans come in and add a bunch of light into areas at times that it shouldn't be illuminated, that can throw off the circadian rhythms and the day and night sensors for a lot of animals who don't understand why there's lights. You know, us as humans, we can say, oh, well, we have street lights so we can see the sidewalk at night. Wildlife in nearby areas don't have that concept, but they still have struggles that go along with it.
I've also heard about how sea turtles which of course, when they hatch, they look for the moon. But it's become very common that instead they actually go to the city lights and that like which is very
Light
sad and they can die of dehydration or predators or just cars hitting them. I think it's also pretty fascinating how much of an impact like insects can have from light pollution. Like about a third of all insects die every single year to artificial lights. This could be like moths flying in circles until they die from exhaustion. Also, a lot of insects are pollinators, which of course benefits us as humans, and a lot of those insects are dying. Taylor,
That's another
Shaylee, do you
big thing
guys?
with pollination, especially when we're already struggling. Bee population is not at its best right now. And think about it, how much that impacts us. And we don't really appreciate or recognize how much of an impact bees have on our day to day life or any insects, really. When you have insects pollinating our crops, our food, I think about going to buy groceries and you don't have coffee or fruit or vegetables. So, insects play a really key role in our lives. And something like light pollution can really harm them. Shaylee, do you have anything else about the environment or wildlife and how they're impacted by light?
Not especially, but I do want to mention, just like you did, that although we may not see the direct impacts that light pollution has on insects or other pollinators, those effects will eventually come back to harm us later on. Because, like you said, some insects are also pollinators, and for from pollinators, that is where we get a lot of our vegetables, fruits, and a lot of the different things that we use on a daily basis. And so, without those pollinators, we would end up seeing more of the effects later on.
So while we're kind of on the topic of how light pollution can impact insects, which impacts us as humans, I'd love to mention the specific things that impact us as humans. And whenever I think about light pollution affecting us, I always think about the blackout in LA in 1994, where people could actually see the Milky Way for the first times in their lives. And they were like calling 911 and saying, oh my gosh, what is this big cloud in the sky? And it was in reality just the stars. And I'm wondering, have you guys ever heard of any other cases like that?
Well, really recently, there was that major blackout in Europe that mostly impacted Spain and Portugal. Shaylee, do you want to elaborate about that for a bit?
Yeah, sure. I did actually hear about it just recently, but I know a lot of people were super surprised that when they looked up at the sky, they could see so much more than just the normal light reflecting back on the clouds. They could see a lot more definition, and their sky looked completely different from what they were used to. And that scared a lot of people, but a lot of the time, it, it scared some people, but it also made them wonder, like, hey, what is there that we cannot see? And how much does that impair what we can see up in the sky?
That brings up a pretty good point that the term light pollution itself is a little misleading because we think of pollution like water pollution or with trash, where it's something that's built up over time and is difficult to remove. You can't just make a lot of landfill pollution just vanish in a second. What's different about light pollution is so, say, like the blackout that happened, if you had a place like New York City where you can hardly see the sky, if all of the lights went out at once, then it would take no time to be able to see the stars in the sky. So it isn't a like built up kind of pollution, which also makes it the easiest pollution that we have to fix.
So really quickly, I do want to touch on what you just said, which is like, let's say all the lights in New York City went out for like an hour. How long would it actually take for people to experience that like euphoria of seeing the stars for the first time? And I believe it would probably only take about like 30 or 40 minutes for their eyes to adjust, which is really crazy considering, that stuff just it doesn't work with things like you just mentioned, like a landfill. It just doesn't
Yeah.
disappear like that, but the stars can come back like that really quickly.
And that's really different is that it's about your eyes adjusting and not the
Yeah.
actual light in the sky.
Yes. But I was going to say light pollution affects humans just as much as it affects insects. It might not kill one third of the population every single year, but it can make us sicker due to not being able to sleep. And it can lead to a lot of car accidents and diseases and stress. It's kind of almost like noise pollution. Like if you lived in a city like New York City, for example, there is constantly sound. You wouldn't be able to sleep. You'd have so much stress, you would get diseases just from the stress, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, just like you said, with that much light pollution, it disrupts our sleep rhythm. And when things disrupt our sleep rhythm, we don't necessarily get enough sleep, or we get so little sleep that it begins to hurt us. So, like you said, it can lead to car accidents. It can increase our amounts of stress, and like anything else, if we don't get enough sleep, it can start to make us sick as well. It can make us more susceptible to getting simple diseases like catching a cold, getting the flu. And so those are just like some of the smaller, more direct impacts that we can see in our everyday lives.
And I want to add and clarify real quick that it's not the light itself that has these effects like car crashes, stress, stuff like that. It's about the lack of sleep. So, like I mentioned earlier, with how animals have their own circadian rhythms that are very dependent on a night and day schedule, humans are the same. And so, when we don't have that and we have artificial light all the time, it can mess up our sleep patterns, which affects every other aspect of our life if we're not getting enough rest.
I think it's also how many of us stay up on our cell phones every single night and how damaging that can be, especially if you're in the dark and it's just the light from your phone. And let's say you have like full brightness and it's right in front of your face, that can also be really damaging. And that can make it harder to sleep. Once again, like you said, Taylor, kind of leading to stress and leading to sickness and being more prone to diseases.
I think also one thing to be said is that we've brought up that there's the health for humans, there's the health for animals. A really big part of why pollution is something to be avoided is because it really damages our ability to study space. So, and you notice this whenever you're in an area that's near an observatory, that they're a lot more strict about how they handle their light at night. So, I have family on the big island of Hawaii, and on the island there's the Mauna Kea Observatory, which has multiple telescopes and is very important for worldwide research. And so on the island, they have a lot of ordinances in place where you're driving around at night and you notice the streetlights, they're warmer toned, they point towards the ground more. It's a bit darker, but it's still fully functional. So light pollution is so harmful to learning and exploring space.
Yeah, especially if we're doing things like research on new star, a planet, anything.
I think also it's interesting how even if you do live in rural parts, you're still affected by the city lights and the sky glow. And our relationships with the sky can be so damaged. I grew up in the city. I now live somewhere where it's rural, but I remember it was really tricky to even have like a connection to the sky because it was just black. There wasn't really like any stars in it at all. Now my relationship with the sky is definitely different, but I constantly think about people who have just never seen the stars before. So I think that that's also a really large impact, like mentally.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Personally, I am really grateful to have grown up in a place like Taos, especially outside of town a bit, where I have always had access to amazing night skies. And that starts from being a young kid and seeing stars every night and seeing the Milky Way, when it's not full moon or cloudy or whatever. So it's most nights you get a really incredible view. And it built this curiosity and interest for me in space, which is a big part of why, from a young age, I was very invested in learning more about astronomy and has helped shape what I'm doing now in terms of astronomy. So there
Yeah.
is definitely, at least in my life, that I've noticed a relationship between dark skies and being able to see the stars and a fascination with space. Shaylee, what about you? How do you feel like light pollution and dark skies have affected your life?
Much like you, Taylor, I grew up in Taos, which I'm really thankful for. And so thankfully I was able to see a lot of the stars, some of the Milky Way at times, but I also think like what would happen if I grew up in the city? I wouldn't have been able to get that sense of wonder when I was a kid and be like, I can see those stars. What else is up there? Because I really think that when you're a kid, that's when you have these most wondrous ideas. And so just like having those skies and being able to see everything early on, it definitely helped influence some of my interests. And especially now, like with what we're doing, if I was in the city where I can't see the stars, would I still be this interested in space as I am now? And so I'm really thankful to have grown up in a place where I can not only see the stars, but also forge a more stronger connection with them.
Taylor, do you want to add anything else on this topic before we move on to solutions for the
I
listeners?
think I think what's been said kind of sums everything up well. So yeah, I'd be happy to go into solutions. Shaylee, do you want to get us started on that?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the main solutions that is brought up a lot of the time when you talk about light pollution is just simple things like the architecture, how certain buildings are built, how the light fixtures on both on and around the buildings are little things like street lights or even just the types of lights that are used. As
Yes, like you were saying, kind of on the architecture and design part, there's a lot. So if you have buildings with windows that are very facing out, where light is going to be going out, that's going to be an issue. So having overhangs, especially over windows, is a really great thing. With street lights, the kind of lights that are just a sphere, and so it's light in every direction, are particularly harmful because a lot of that light goes up into the sky. So having a downward facing light where the top half is covered makes a huge difference while still being fully functional.
I think also speaking of specifically like light fixtures, it's also important to bring up choosing warmer light bulbs because brighter light bulbs can have a lot larger of an effect, a lot more significant of an effect. As I mentioned before as well, light pollution can come from like porch lights. So a solution could be instigating motion activated lights instead of always leaving your porch lights on or turning off the lights when they're not needed, like during the day.
And that's a really good point to bring up is motion light and having them off when they're not needed. And so things like street lights, that's a different case. But when you're talking about personal, more manageable outdoor lights, prioritize and think about lights on, when do I not? And just kind of take time to be mindful of how much light am I emitting? And there's always that argument in one person, what can I do as an individual to make a difference? But the thing is that if every one person, every one individual takes some time out of the day to outside or switch out their porch lights for a warmer tone, that really fast.
Speaking more on policies, I think it's also important to bring up the National Light Pollution Regulation in France, which occurred in 2013, which just requires all offices, shops, and buildings to switch off lights between 1 and 7 a.m. unless occupied. And this was actually really, really helpful for their light pollution. I was wondering, do you guys know anything about this that is happening in Taos right now?
So Taos
Or
specifically, in a lot of places in New Mexico, are very land conservation focused. northern New Mexico has a culture of appreciating the land and staying close to it. And so naturally, along with that comes people who want to preserve our night sky. And so we do have a handful of dark sky ordinances in Taos. And if you go on the darksky.org website, they have a subdivision for New Mexico.
Yeah, so specifically with different resources, if you go to deardarksky.com, you can look up different areas and see the different amounts of light pollution. And so just looking at Taos specifically, there isn't a whole lot of light pollution, especially if you compare it to much larger cities. Yeah, so other resources, you can always go to darkskies.org. It's a great resource. Hattie, would you like to add a little bit more to this? Or to that?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to mention we just recently had a guest, Dr. Julia Bluebird, and she mentioned something about how she wants her students, or this is her advice to her students, to go outside and look at the sky at least once or twice a week. And as I mentioned before, I was just thinking how many people don't really get that opportunity. But I feel like also going outside when you have the chance to look at the sky, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who live in rural areas who just don't really go outside or don't really have the time or don't even really think about it. I think that that's obviously it's not gonna, stop light pollution, but it gives you a little bit of time to really appreciate what's outside.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to bring up is just take a moment and pick a night. I think, pick a night where it's clear and where the moon isn't too bright and take a moment to really observe and take in and appreciate the night sky and think about, what do you have access to considering the light in your area? What could you have access to if there were less light? And think about people living in places who don't have that access.
Yeah, I feel like just going out and appreciating the sky, whatever sky you have, whether it's heavily polluted or not. I feel like just going out and taking some time to look up at the sky is a great way to just strengthen your connection with the stars and the moon and everything that you can see. I know for us, since our skies are a lot less light polluted, we're able to see a lot more stars and we can see the moon and everything. But even if the skies around you have a lot more light pollution, you can always just still look up at the sky and admire the moon. So I feel like regardless of where you're at or how much light pollution has affected skies, I feel it's always just a great thing to go outside and just appreciate the sky just generally. So I'll turn it back over to Hattie.
I think honestly, we've probably talked about everything that we want the viewers to listen to right now. Once again, as mentioned on every episode, if you guys want us to talk about anything specific, just let us know and we'll talk about it. Anything else you guys want to say before we wrap up the episode today?
I wanted to real quick, I would like to recommend look into your city's dark sky policies and ordinances and check out the darksky.org website. Anyways, thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you for supporting us. We will see you guys next week. I'm Taylor.
I'm Shaylee.
And I'm Hattie.